There is a specific kind of empty that the avoidant is sitting with right now that they did not anticipate and cannot adequately explain to themselves. Not the ordinary empty of solitude, which is familiar territory. The avoidant has always had a functional relationship with their own company, has always been capable of inhabiting their own space, without the specific, restless, needing to be filled quality that aloneness produces in people with more anxious attachment. That ordinary empty has always been manageable, has always been in some ways preferable to the specific costs of closeness. The avoidant knows how to be alone, has built an entire psychological architecture partly around the capacity to be alone without it becoming the crisis that it becomes for other people. But this is not that empty. This is different in kind, not just degree. This is the empty that arrives when someone who was consistently present, whose presence, however taken for granted, however inadequately valued while it was there, was functioning as a background warmth in the interior landscape, is not just absent, but genuinely gone. Not gone in the temporary, will return, the dynamic is paused way of previous distances. Gone in the specific quality of someone who has detached. Who is not on the other side of the silence, waiting for the right conditions to reconnect. Who is not monitoring the dynamic from a distance, still oriented toward it, still available to be reached by the right approach. Who has genuinely, completely turned their attention elsewhere and is living a life in which the avoidant is not the primary variable. The detachment is what makes this empty different from all the previous empties. And understanding why the detachment specifically, not the absence, not the silence, not even the ending, but the complete detachment, produces this particular quality of empty in the avoidant is what this conversation is about. Before going into the psychology, something important needs to be said about what this conversation is and what it is not. It is an honest examination of a real psychological phenomenon. The avoidant who hurt you feeling empty because of your complete detachment is a genuine experience worth understanding accurately, not to provide comfort that they are suffering, not to suggest that their emptiness is your responsibility to address, not to imply that the emptiness is evidence of change or readiness or the availability of something different from what the dynamic previously delivered. Simply to understand accurately, because accurate understanding is always more useful than flattering distortion. And the accurate understanding of what your detachment is producing in the avoidant is part of the full picture of the situation that you deserve to see clearly, rather than through either the lens of hope or the lens of protective cynicism. The emptiness is real. Its reality is not sufficient to require anything of you. Both things are simultaneously true, and neither cancels the other. What detachment actually is, as distinct from absence or silence, or the managed distance of someone who is still oriented toward the dynamic, needs to be examined precisely because the distinction is the entire source of the avoidant's specific experience of empty. Absence is the physical or communicative unavailability of someone who is still present as an orientation point, who is still in the interior landscape of the dynamic, the primary reference, whose return is still, at some level, anticipated or hoped for or planned around. Absence produces the specific activated seeking of an attachment system that is missing a significant object. It produces urgency and longing and the specific pressurized quality of something that is wanted and not currently available. It is painful, but it is oriented. The pain has a direction. It points toward the thing that is missing and produces the motivation to close the gap. Detachment is categorically different. It is not the absence of someone who is still an orientation point. It is the removal of the orientation point itself, the genuine complete reorientation of the self towards something other than the dynamic. The specific, quiet, unannounced shift in what the interior landscape is organized around. The avoidant is no longer the primary reference. The dynamic is no longer the primary variable. The attention that was previously, even in the silences and the distances, still fundamentally directed toward the avoidant and the connection. That attention has genuinely moved. Not as a performance, not as a strategy. As the honest, forward-moving, life-inhabiting reality of someone who has processed enough of the experience to no longer require the dynamic as the organizing center of their emotional world. The avoidant can feel this distinction, not always consciously, at the level of the nervous system's relational sensing, which is far more accurate than the avoidant typically credits it. The difference between your absence and your detachment is not visible in any single signal. It is present in the gestalt, in the specific quality of the silence, In the absence of the specific, subtle, entirely involuntary signals of continued orientation that absence, even deliberate, maintained absence, tends to produce. The occasional checking of a profile, the slight adjustment of behavior in contexts where you might encounter information about each other, the specific, almost imperceptible quality of a silence that is being held rather than a silence that simply is. Your complete detachment has none of that. And the absence of it, the specific, unprecedented quality of a silence that simply is, that has no held quality, that is not being maintained toward any particular end, is what produces the empty that the avoidant did not anticipate. Why does complete detachment produce empty specifically, when the avoidance pattern has always been organized around creating distance, when they are, functionally, the architect of the separation between you? When the withdrawal was theirs and the silence was theirs, and the emotional unavailability that finally exhausted your orientation toward them was theirs. This apparent paradox, the avoidant who created the distance experiencing empty when the other person genuinely detaches, is the central psychological question of this entire conversation. And it resolves when you understand something specific about how the avoidance attachment system was actually operating throughout the dynamic. The avoidant was not indifferent. This has been established in various forms throughout this series of conversations, but deserves a fresh examination from the specific angle of how the attachment system was running beneath the managed distance. The avoidance attachment system was attached, genuinely, specifically, at the level below the management strategies and the defensive architecture and the withdrawal patterns. It was attached to you in the particular, neurological, involuntary way that human attachment systems attach to significant others. It had encoded you, had registered your presence as significant, had calibrated to your specific qualities, the particular texture of your attention, the specific quality of your care, the unique way your presence affected the interior experience, in the automatic, non-volitional way that genuine attachment always operates. And the withdrawal, the distance, the managed separation, the defensive architecture maintaining the closeness at a controlled level, did not detach the attachment system. The withdrawal was a behavioral strategy. The attachment remained, the avoidant was creating behavioral distance while the attachment system remained oriented toward you. Withdrawn in behavior, attached in the interior, and this combination, behavioral distance with interior attachment, was the specific, sustainable, psychologically coherent configuration that the avoidance patterns produced. The management of the fear through behavioral withdrawal while the genuine feeling continued to run underneath. This configuration required your continued availability to function, required at some background level the knowledge that the connection was still there, that the orientation was mutual even if the expression of it was unequal, that the floor, the specific foundational, always there quality of your presence as a significant other in the avoidance relational world was holding even when the avoidant was not actively standing on it. Your detachment removed the floor, not just the behavioral availability, the orientation, the background mutualness of the connection, the specific quality of being in each other's relational world that the attachment system requires in order to experience the behavioral distance as manageable rather than as genuine loss. And without the floor, the configuration collapses. The behavioral distance that was sustainable when the interior attachment was mutual becomes, when the interior attachment is no longer mutual, when you have genuinely reoriented, not managed distance, but actual isolation. Not chosen solitude, but the specific, unwanted, genuinely felt empty of someone whose attachment system is still running an orientation that the other person has ceased to share. The empty has specific qualities that distinguish it from other forms of avoidant discomfort, and that illuminate what your detachment is actually producing in their interior experience. The first quality is directionlessness. The ordinary discomforts of the avoidance relational life, the fear of closeness, the activation of the defensive architecture, the managed distance, are all directional. They are organized in relation to something. The fear is organized around the approach of closeness. The activation is organized around the specific threat that intimacy represents. The distance is organized around the specific thing that is being kept at a managed remove. Even the withdrawal was organized around you, was a response to the specific qualities of your presence and what those qualities activated. The empty is not organized around anything. It does not point toward a specific thing or away from a specific thing. It simply is a specific, featureless, not organized around anything absence of the orienting reference point that the attachment system has been using. And for someone whose interior experience has always been highly organized, has always been structured by the elaborate, carefully maintained architecture of the defensive strategies, the experience of unorganized empty is genuinely unfamiliar and genuinely disorienting. The second quality is the specific flatness of encounters that were previously animated by the background knowledge of your orientation. The avoidant's daily experience had a quality to it, subtle, not always consciously registered but present, that was produced by the knowledge of your existence in their relational world, the background warmth of being significantly cared about. The specific, quiet, always available quality of mattering to someone in the particular way you mattered, this quality did not require active engagement to be present. It was background, infrastructure, not noticed until it is gone. Now it is gone, and the daily encounters, the same interactions, the same activities, the same external texture of a life that is not visibly changed, have a flatness that the avoidant cannot adequately attribute to any specific cause, cannot point to anything that has objectively changed in the external architecture of their life, and explain through that pointing why things feel the specific way they feel. The flatness is interior. It is the absence of the background warmth, the specific, targeted, not produced by anything else quality of knowing that someone who saw you and loved you specifically was oriented toward you. The third quality is the involuntary reaching that finds nothing, the automatic. Below volitional tendency of the attachment system to orient towards its significant object, which has been running continuously beneath the behavioral management throughout the entire dynamic, encountering in its orientation the specific, unprecedented, entirely unfamiliar experience of nothing. Not the temporary unavailability of the absent person who is still in the relational world. The genuine, complete, orientation-shifted nothing of someone who has detached. And the reaching that finds nothing is one of the most specifically uncomfortable experiences available to an attachment system. It does not produce urgency in the ordinary way of the reaching for something unavailable. It produces a specific, hollow, slightly bewildering quality of reaching for something that is no longer there to be reached. The avoidant who used to hurt you is sitting with this empty and doing something specific with it that is worth understanding. Because the empty, like all difficult interior experiences, does not simply sit. It generates a response, it produces a direction. And the direction it produces tells you something important about where the avoidant is in their own interior journey and what the empty is and is not pointing toward. The initial response to the empty is almost always the attempt to attribute it to something other than what it actually is. The avoidance management strategies are very practiced at finding alternative attributions for interior experiences that would, if attributed accurately, require the kind of honest self-confrontation that the management strategies were built to prevent. The empty gets attributed to general life dissatisfaction, to seasonal mood, to the ordinary non-relational variability of interior experience that everyone has and that requires no specific accounting, to tiredness or stress, or the entirely manageable fluctuation of someone who is fundamentally fine and simply having a more difficult period than usual. These attributions are attempted, and they fail, not dramatically, not in a single obvious moment of the attribution being exposed as insufficient. Gradually, in the specific way that an incorrect explanation fails to adequately account for the experience it is supposed to explain. The general life dissatisfaction attribution does not explain why the dissatisfaction has this specific quality rather than the ordinary qualities of general life dissatisfaction. The seasonal mood attribution does not explain why the mood has this specific flatness rather than the ordinary qualities of seasonal mood. The management strategy's attribution finding function keeps producing explanations, and the empty keeps failing to fit the explanations, and the gap between the explanation and the actual experience keeps widening. And in the widening gap, the accurate attribution becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. You, the specific, complete, genuine detachment of someone who has a significant orientation point and is no longer oriented toward this. The specific, targeted, not produced by anything else quality of the empty as the experience of an attachment system running an orientation that has ceased to be mutual. When the accurate attribution finally arrives, when the empty is correctly identified as the experience of your complete detachment rather than attributed to something more manageable, the avoidant encounters a specific and significant internal moment, not a dramatic crisis. A quiet, specific, honest moment of seeing the situation clearly. And in that moment of clear seeing, several things are simultaneously present. The recognition of what the detachment means, that the floor is not temporarily absent, that the orientation is genuinely shifted, that the person who was consistently there, consistently caring, consistently oriented toward this connection despite its insufficiencies, that person has completed a process that the avoidance behaviors were always moving toward and that has now arrived at its honest conclusion. The recognition of what produced the detachment, not external circumstances, not the random, neutral, no one's fault drifting apart that endings sometimes are. The specific, clear, direct connection between the avoidance patterns and the detachment those patterns eventually produced. The hurt that was caused, the emotional unavailability that was maintained, the withdrawals that were chosen, the repair that arrived too late or not at all. The consistent, patterned failure to show up for someone who was consistently showing up. The honest, unavoidable connection between the cause and the effect, and the recognition of what is now absent that will not be automatically replaced. The specific qualities of your presence, your attention, your consistency, your particular quality of care, the specific warmth of being loved by someone who sees clearly and loves generously, that are not generic qualities available from any warm presence, that were yours specifically. That the empty is the specific shape of, because the empty is yours specifically, not the generic empty of aloneness, the specific empty of you, of what you were and what you gave and what your complete detachment has removed. What does the avoidant do with this clear seeing? This is the question that the entire psychological arc of this conversation has been building toward. Because the clear seeing is available to most avoidants who have hurt someone significantly and watched the complete detachment arrive as the honest consequence. The seeing is not the rare thing. What is done with the seeing is the rare thing. Some avoidants, in this moment of clear seeing, reach not from the urgency of activated loss, though that urgency is present, from something quieter and more honest, from the specific, newly available recognition that what they are experiencing as empty is the accurate experience of what their patterns consistently produced. That the emptiness is not the accidental byproduct of circumstances, but the natural, entirely predictable outcome of choices. Conditioned choices, fear-driven choices, but choices nonetheless made repeatedly in the face of someone who deserved different. This reaching, when it comes from this place, has a different quality than the urgency-driven reaching that other forms of avoidant activation produce. It is slower, more considered, less immediately available, and more genuinely earned. It carries the specific weight of someone who has sat with the honest attribution and allowed it to produce the honest reckoning rather than the managed reattribution. It arrives when it arrives, as something closer to genuine accountability than most of what the dynamic previously produced. Other avoidants, in the same moment of clear seeing, do something different. They allow the seeing to occur, and then, through the operation of the management strategies, gradually restore a sufficient distance from the honest attribution to make the empty manageable without the reckoning. They feel the weight of the clear seeing briefly and then find the specific, avoidant characteristic path around the full confrontation with what the clear seeing reveals. They may reach eventually, but from the managed version of the recognition rather than the full version. From the urgency of the empty rather than the honest accounting of what produced it. You will be able to tell the difference, not from the reaching itself, from the quality of what the reaching carries. Whether it is specific enough to have come from the genuine reckoning, whether it tolerates the complexity of your response, whether it is accompanied by the behavioral evidence over time that distinguishes genuine change from the managed return. Your complete detachment is not something you achieved easily. It was not the clean, uncomplicated, I decided to move on and then moved on experience that the word detachment can sometimes suggest. It was the product of the specific, daily, sometimes hourly work of continuing to choose the reorientation toward your own life when the pull toward the old orientation was present, and sometimes strong. Of continuing to build the internal ground when the building was quiet and unwitnessed and produced no immediate reward. Of continuing to choose yourself over the monitoring of a dynamic that no longer deserved the monitoring. The detachment took everything the earlier parts of this journey built: the self-knowledge, the restored perceptual confidence, the accurate baseline for what adequate love looks like. The specific hard-won capacity to feel the pull toward the avoidant and toward the familiar warmth of the dynamic, and choose against that pull the honest direction of someone who knows what they deserve and will not accept less as a permanent arrangement. All of that built the detachment, And the detachment is now producing in the avoidant the specific empty that your presence was always providing the warmth for. The empty is the shape of what you were. The exact size and contour and specific quality of your contribution to the interior landscape of someone who was not adequately acknowledging the contribution while it was present. That empty is a form of tribute, not the tribute you wanted or deserved or needed, not the daily present while you were there acknowledgement. That would have changed the dynamic, but an honest one. The most honest one available from someone whose patterns prevented the more useful forms of honesty while they were available. The avoidant is feeling the exact shape of what you were. That shape is remarkable. It is specific and significant and genuinely extraordinary in the way that only things that were real and generous and offered without the defensive architecture that would have made them smaller are remarkable. You were that. You brought that. The empty is its honest measure, and you are no longer there to fill it. You are building something else. Something that will be filled not with the empty shape of what someone failed to value, but with the living present, adequately honored contribution of everything you are, offered to a life and to people, and eventually to a love that can see it while it is there. That is where the detachment was always pointing, not toward their empty, toward your full, the full life, the full presence, the full undiminished, completely inhabited version of yourself, that the dynamic was always costing you pieces of. It is being built, in the quiet of the detachment, in the ordinary days that belong to you, in the specific, daily, unglamorous, entirely worthwhile work of someone who finally chose themselves completely and found, in the complete choosing, that themselves was worth the choosing, completely. The complete choosing of yourself is where this lands, and it deserves to be honored in a way that is honest rather than simply elevated. Because the elevation, the building of the language towards something increasingly grand and resonant, can, if it is not careful, become its own form of distortion. A beautiful distortion, a well-intentioned one, but a distortion nonetheless. The truth of where you are is quieter than the language that has been describing it. It is not the cinematic arrival at wholeness. It is the ordinary, specific, daily reality of someone who is doing better than they were, who has more of their own attention available than they did during the dynamic, who is less organized around monitoring someone else's emotional climate and more organized around their own genuine experience, who has clearer perception of what they need and clearer language for what they will not accept, who is, on most days, more themselves than they were during the period the dynamic was running. That is real, that is significant, and it is also not finished. Not because there is something wrong with where you are, but because people are not finished. The work of becoming more fully yourself does not complete at the conclusion of a difficult relationship. It continues, it builds on what the experience produced, the clarity, the self-knowledge, the restored sense of your own worth, and it moves into whatever comes next, carrying those things as genuine resources rather than as resolved chapters. The avoidance empty is continuing. That is also the honest truth of where things are. The empty does not resolve quickly. For some avoidance, it does not resolve at all in the sense of being adequately processed. It gets managed into something livable, gets filed among the significant losses that are acknowledged as significant without being allowed to produce the full reckoning they were pointing toward. The interior landscape adjusts around the shape of the empty the way that interiors adjust around any permanent absence, not healed, accommodated. For others, the empty does its full work, reaches the level of honest attribution, produces the genuine reckoning, becomes the specific, finally undeniable experience of consequence that intellectual understanding of the patterns was never able to produce. And from that genuine reckoning, something begins to shift, not in a single dramatic moment, in the specific daily unglamorous way that genuine shifts always actually occur, in the small behavioral instance-level choices that accumulate into a different way of being in the world, a different way of responding to the approach of closeness, a different relationship to the vulnerability that love requires. A different answer to the question that the patterns were always answering in the direction of withdrawal. Whether the avoidant in your specific situation is in the first group or the second is not something you can determine from outside their interior. It is not something that their reaching, if it comes, will immediately reveal. It is something that becomes visible over time, in the behavioral evidence of ordinary conditions, in the consistency of showing up when nothing is at stake. And here is the honest thing about that. The determination of which group they are in is not the most important project available to you right now. the monitoring of their interior journey, even from the position of complete detachment, even as intellectual curiosity rather than as the anxious monitoring of the dynamic, is still a form of allocation of your attention toward them rather than toward the continuing, genuinely important project of your own life. Your own life, in the aftermath of the complete detachment, has specific things in it that deserve the attention the dynamic was consuming, not vague things. Specific ones. There is the restoration of the relationships that the dynamic's gravity was pulling attention away from. The friendships that received the residual attention after the dynamic's requirements were met. The family connections that were present but not fully inhabited because a significant portion of the inhabiting capacity was allocated elsewhere. The specific people who were there throughout the dynamic and who received less of you than they deserved because the dynamic was requiring more of you than was fair. These relationships have their own health and their own needs and their own capacity to receive and return the quality of attention and care that you bring. And they have been in many cases patient, present in the background, available in the ways that people who genuinely care are available, not demanding more than you could give during the dynamic. Quietly, consistently there, turning the fuller version of your attention toward them, the version that is not carrying the chronic background processing of the dynamic, is one of the most immediately available and most genuinely rewarding investments of the reclaimed attention. Not because it is a substitute for romantic love or the specific quality of connection that the dynamic contained at its best, but because these relationships have their own genuine nourishment to offer, their own specific, irreplaceable qualities, their own capacity to reflect back the version of you that the dynamic was obscuring. There is also the relationship with your own creativity and curiosity, and the specific, personal, entirely yours quality of intellectual and experiential life that the dynamic was quietly absorbing bandwidth from. The projects that were started and not sustained because the attention kept getting pulled back to the monitoring. The interests that were peripheral because the center was always occupied. The version of your daily life that exists when you are genuinely, fully present in it, rather than partially present with the remainder allocated to the background processing of someone else's patterns. This version of your daily life is not a consolation for the absence of romantic love. It is the actual, genuine, fully inhabitable reality of a person who has their own attention, who can be interested in things because the things are genuinely interesting, rather than as a strategy for managing the pain of the dynamic. Who can invest in projects because the investment is genuinely motivating, rather than as a way of filling the space that the withdrawal left. Who can be present in their own experience because the experience is the actual content of their life, rather than the background against which the primary drama of the dynamic was playing out. This is available to you now, more available than it was during the dynamic, in the specific, direct, non-metaphorical sense of having more cognitive and emotional bandwidth for genuine engagement with your own experience. There is something worth saying about what the avoidance empty ultimately means for you, from the most practical and most honest available position. It means that what you brought to the connection was real, that the quality of your care and your attention and your consistent, generous presence was specific enough and significant enough that its complete removal produced a specific and significant emptiness in the person who was receiving it. That the contribution was not imagined or exaggerated or inflated by the hoping, it was real in the specific, measurable sense of its absence being felt as real loss. That is worth knowing, worth holding clearly rather than modestly deflecting. The impact of your presence was genuine. The empty is its honest measure. And it also means that you made the right choice. Not in the sense that ending the dynamic was without cost or without grief, or without the specific pain of having something real become something that could not be sustained, but in the sense that the choice to detach completely, to genuinely reorient rather than to continue the orientation towards something that was consistently returning less than it was receiving, was the honest, self-respecting, entirely appropriate response to the accounting of the dynamic. The empty confirms it. If the contribution had been small, the empty would be small. The empty is not small. The empty is the size of everything you brought, which means everything you brought was real and significant and deserved to be valued while it was present, which it was not, which is why you left. The empty is the dynamic finally, honestly, at the level of the avoidance actual experience, acknowledging what it could not acknowledge while you were in it. That acknowledgement, however belated, is not nothing. It is also not enough. The acknowledgement does not retroactively change what the dynamic was, does not undo the specific repeated patterned cost of being consistently undervalued. does not restore the bandwidth that the monitoring consumed or the self that the dynamic quietly shaped, does not make the history into something it was not. It simply confirms the honest size of your contribution. And the honest size of your contribution was always the honest measure of your worth, which was significant, which was real, which was, in the specific and undeniable language of their empty extraordinary. The avoidant feels empty because you were extraordinary, because the quality of what you brought was specific enough and real enough and genuinely rare enough that its complete absence produced a specific and genuine void that the ordinary available warmth of ordinary available connections does not fill. You can hold that. You can let the knowledge of it settle into you as something simply true, rather than as something that requires a decision or produces an obligation or needs to be converted into an action. It is simply true, you were extraordinary in the connection. The empty is its confirmation. And the extraordinary quality of what you brought, of what you are, what you give, how you love when you love fully, belongs to you, is yours to carry forward, into the life you are building, into the relationships that will receive it, into the eventual, possible, entirely available future in which what you bring is met by someone whose architecture includes the capacity to value it while it is present, not in its absence, in its actual, living, daily, ordinary Tuesday presence. That is where your extraordinary belongs. In the living, not in the empty it leaves behind. In the full present, completely inhabited reality of a life that knows its own worth and meets that worth with the daily, specific, unglamorous, entirely genuine act of showing up for yourself. Completely. As you have been. As you continue to do. One ordinary day at a time.